Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lizzie Webb, and I'm the CEO of The Next Economy. I'm joining you today from Meanjin or Brisbane on the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar on the economy we could have. And today I'm joined in conversation by my colleague, Dr. Catherine Trebek, who's our Program Director for Economic Systems Change. Welcome, Catherine.
Thanks, Liz. Great to be here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Super. So for today's discussion, we're joined by quite a diverse range of participants across climate environment organisations, community groups, government and businesses as well. And I think we've been really heartened by the level of interest in Catherine's report, The Economy We Could Have, and in today's webinar as well on economic systems change. Before I go any further, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would like to recognise the enduring connection First Nations people have to country and also welcome many First Nations participants we have on today's webinar. So today we're going to have a discussion about Australia's economy, the divides it creates, but perhaps most importantly, the incredible examples of work that are underway right across Australia and internationally to shift our economic systems and practices to ones that regenerate our environment and address social inequity. Catherine, this is the culmination of well over a year's work and in fact decades worth of experience on economic systems change. Congratulations on the recent publication of The Economy We Could Have.
Thanks, Liz. Team effort very much. And we've got my co-author, Jolly Wakefield, here too, who's done a power of work to get this report over the line.
Thanks, Catherine. It was a team effort, and I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the support of the Greater Melbourne Foundation for our work in economic systems change and in bringing this publication to you. Yeah. So in just a moment, I'm going to do some framing for today's conversation. But before I do that, there's a couple of more practical details that I'd like to run through with you. We're going to kick off with a short presentation from Catherine on the paper. And then after that, the two of us are going to have a bit of a conversation to help draw out further some of the key messages and connections into the Next Economy's work. After that, we've got lots of time for a Q&A session, which I'll help facilitate with Catherine. And I did want to say a huge thank you to everybody who shared questions with us in advance. We actually got dozens and dozens of great questions, and we'll do our best to work through a couple of those with you today. There are a few sort of practical matters, I guess, about how to engage in today's webinar. We do have quite a lot of people joining us, so we'd invite you, if you don't mind, to keep your microphone on silent, but would invite you to keep your video on so that when Catherine and I are engaging with you, we can see you there. And you're very welcome to engage via the chat, particularly when we come to the point where Catherine's finished her presentation and we're seeking questions from today's webinar participants. We are going to be recording, in fact, we are already recording today's webinar, so there'll be an opportunity for us to share that back with you and for dozens of other people who were apologies for today. I'd love to invite you to contribute through the chat box with curiosity, respect, and openness. We are really trying to foster a sense of collaboration and collegiality here, as well as a sense of hope. So I'd love to invite you to keep that in mind as you engage. Now, Catherine, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to set the scene, if I may, and to share why the work that we're undertaking on economic systems change, I think, is so important. So, as your paper really kind of delves into in quite some detail, Australia faces a whole range of widening social divides across housing, health, income, and opportunity. However, change is very possible, and we see incredible examples around the country and overseas of work that communities, businesses, and governments are already doing to address these divides. And I know very much from the Next Economy's experience with our work in regions that we're seeing two things happen. One is this sense of frustration with the status quo, and the flip side of that, we're seeing incredible proactivity and an aspiration to start thinking really differently about how the economy can serve thriving communities and regenerate the environment. So for context, the Next Economy has been working with regions in partnership since 2018. And our work is supporting a particular type of region, and that's regions that are grappling with multiple and often complex impacts on their economy. And for our work, that's typically in the context of worsening climate impacts and also decarbonisation as we transition towards net zero. So a lot of our work is with regions that are host to fossil fuel industries and also major renewable energy developments. So we work with regions and across all types of stakeholders to support iterative and participatory planning processes so that regions really feel that they can be much more in the driver's seat and a partner in economic development processes whilst tackling these sort of complex challenges. So our work is right across Australia in locations like Mount Isa, Hay, Central Queensland, particularly Gladstone. And then we work with those regions to elevate insights and lessons, and we share those then with industry and government and other regions with the aspiration that together we can all help build economies that are climate safe, environmentally regenerative and socially just. And I think, Catherine, the reason I've provided that framing is that at the heart of the work that's underway in regions is the economy, and importantly, our relationship with the economy and our sense of agency about how we shift it and build the economy that we want for the future. And I think what's exciting is that regions right across the country are starting to ask, what does good development look like? And what is our relationship with the economy? And that very much then links into the opportunity to have these questions at a much bigger level as states, as a nation, to say, how is the economy really going to serve the future that we want for people and the environment, rather than the other way around. And I think your paper does a wonderful job of showing the diversity of ways in which we can take action. And that's really at the crux, I think, of today's conversation. So on that point, I'd love to hand over to you, and I understand you're going to share a presentation with us over the next 15-20 minutes to give us insight into the new paper. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Liz, and hi everyone. Wonderful, really wonderful to be with you. I'm actually in Naarm in Melbourne on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and also want to pay my respects to First Nations colleagues and leadership. And it is very hard not to be doing work on economic system change and just see the incredible wisdom way of approaching the economy that's so inherent in Indigenous thinking here in Australia and around the world. Things like collective goals, connection to country, long-term thinking, and just think that if the rest of us had paid much more heed to some of those lessons, the world might just not be in such a precarious state that it is. I also want to say a huge thanks to the Next Economy team who have pulled this together. Our webinars might look simple from the outside, and hopefully they feel simple to be part of and to join as a guest, but there's a lot of work happening in the background, and huge thanks to Jolie and Fiona and Adam and the team who've made this happen. And I'm going to just try to pull out a few headlines from the report. At one point, this report, I'll confess, was over 400 pages long. We've condensed it down to, I think, around 70. Huge thanks to Jolie's wisdom. And now I'm going to just try to reduce that to a couple of key themes as the basis for our conversation. But I would encourage folks to jump on the website, download the report. It's there free for everyone to enjoy. It's broken up with lots of different design elements and some fabulous cartoons from our colleague Jess Harwood, I'll share some of those with you now. But as Liz has said, that really the heart of so many dominant economic discussions, a critical question is missing, one that's rarely asked, and that is what principles and values need to underpin good development. And of course, the Next Economy dives into that question in its work with regions across Australia. And if we pay attention to that question, it then enables us to start asking, I think, this really fundamental discussion of, if we can begin to imagine an economy that serves us rather than us and the planet serving the economy. And that shift in perspective to thinking about the economy as a means rather than the ends in itself is at the heart of this report. And the report reminds us, and it takes the reader through the reality that the economy is not like gravity. It is very much human-made, and it can be redesigned with different decisions, different priorities, different actors brought to the fore, different systems, different ways of measuring. It also reminds us that everyone in different ways participates in the economy. Yes, sometimes in the market as shoppers or investors or employees, as employers, but also in our households, in our interaction with government agencies and in communities, anywhere where we are distributing and sharing resources and taking care of each other. That is going back to the original meaning of the economy, as the report explains. And as Liz has said, communities across Australia are starting to think things can be better than they currently are. And many of them are starting to ask deeper, bigger questions about the economy and starting to imagine and reimagine their economy as one that serves us rather than the other way around. So that's really heartening. That's a sense of possibility and a sense that these conversations are really starting to come to the fore. But so often, I'd say lurking at the background of many social policy discussions, many political debates, is this question of how far upstream are we really prepared to go in Australia? And so often you see a lot of discussion really just about racing around, patching up harm, maybe at best delaying it. But there's too little conversations about how do we really prevent harm happening in the first place? Or even better, how do we create contexts in which people and planet thrive from the very, very beginning? So let's look at the story of the Australian economy so far. And one of the, I think, beginnings of that conversation that I think we so often in debates about the economy in Australia avoid is that so much of Australia's apparent economic wealth in a financial sense is on the basis of stolen land and unpaid rent. And I think that's an important point to begin any discussion about reimagining, rethinking the Australian economy, that we have, centuries of unpaid rent to First Nations communities. In more recent times, the Australian economy also is a story of, from what I call, what others call pre-distribution, in that work used to work for many people, in particular in the post-Second World War era, in that if you were white, working, able male, having a job would pay you because of various institutions enough to build a decent life. But as this beautiful cartoon from Jess depicts here, we've moved now to a situation where it is your ownership of assets, often through inheritance, that determines your life chances. And so the story is that we've moved from valuing fair work through pre-distribution to privileging asset ownership. And of course, Australia so often prides itself on not being an aristocracy, but in many ways we are an assetocracy, where it is your ownership of those assets that dominates your ability to build the life you want to live. We've seen in recent decades a retreat from universal provision and social safety net. We've seen more means testing, a lot of privatisation and deregulation in many sectors, not least the financial sector. And we see today that so many of production and consumption patterns, particularly from those who have the most, putting huge pressure on the planet and on Australia's precious environment. And we're seeing in our news headlines and down the street the impact of that environmental pressure every day. And yet, at a glance, if you're looking from afar, Australia performs relatively well in many respects compared to other countries. In many respects, we are the lucky country. We've got high life expectancy, high relative levels of education, high levels of income. And yet often that is measured in averages. And so the tyranny of averages often masks huge inequalities that blight and undermine and divide Australian communities in housing, in food security, employment, and access to basic services. And so I think one of the tasks is to not just take those averages and those headline measures, but as Jess has depicted here, look under the bonnet. And then we see it is less of a pretty picture. There are huge problems for us to confront and deal with in Australia's society. So things like, in such a wealthy country in financial terms, 1 in 7 people, 1 in 6 children living in poverty. And of course, that's got, as many of you will be familiar with, disproportionate impact on our First Nations communities, single parents, people with disabilities, those from non-English speaking backgrounds. These are the sort of the divides of the economy not serving enough people. We see rising levels of economic insecurity, the rising amount of precariousness in terms of work, people treated as just-in-time inventory, higher living costs and underfunded social services. And we see those influential actors, many of them from that assetocracy that I mentioned earlier, resisting and undermining even the most tentative efforts to reform and change. And the economy is an upstream driver of so many of those challenges. When you look at Australia's health problems, our health inequalities, levels of poverty, things like loneliness, homelessness, environmental damage, when you stop and ask, why are those challenges emerging? And you keep asking why, and you keep asking why again and again, you so often find yourself facing the economic system. And so the task is to have the economy in our sights if we are really serious about attending to those challenges, if we want to have a fighting chance of dealing with those challenges and addressing those divides that undermine communities across Australia. The good news is, and this is my favourite part of the presentation because I can turn to the positive aspects now, is that communities across the country are already starting to reimagine their economies and starting to show, even in tentative steps or in microcosm, what is possible. And as you see in this picture here, the next economy is quite literally on the journey with them, with many of those communities. And there are very, very diverse conversations that are happening in diverse communities, but also seen in often opinion polling, in the results of deliberative democracy exercises that many amazing organisations across Australia and even globally have hosted. But you also get a sense of what people really need, even looking at literature and evidence from neuroscience, from sociology, from psychology about what makes people thrive. And so all those different diverse sources of what most matters to people when we think about what does quality of life look like can be summed up in different ways. And here I want to offer what our colleagues at the Global Wellbeing Economy Alliance have pulled together. And they describe these as the 5 needs that we need the economy to deliver for people and planet. And I suspect they will resonate with people. Things like dignity, participation, purpose, fairness, and nature at their heart, because they do reflect what we hear when people are given a chance to stop and nominate what is most important to them, to their families, to the country they want to live in, and also what we know makes people healthy, what makes people thrive. These are the sorts of things we need the economy to be designed and to deliver. So how do we go about getting there? What sort of changes do we need to build in our economic system to create that sort of economy that enables people to thrive, to deliver fairness, participation, connection, and sense of purpose and dignity, that puts nature at the forefront of our thinking about the economy? This is our simple iteration of a really beautiful concept developed by systems thinker Frank Gehls. And why I think it's helpful is because it lays out the different levels at which system change happens. So if you start at the bottom, that's where lots of different practices happen. Incredible initiatives by communities, amazing enterprises, really wonderful things that are happening in communities, in cities, and in countries here in Australia, around the world. And I'll share a few examples of those in just a moment. And above that, you have the policy regime. This is the terrain of regulations, taxes, subsidies, various policy instruments that shape or enable or hamper different practices to happen at that practice niche level. And then across that is the paradigm level, really how we think about the economy. What's our mindset about? What big questions are we allowing ourselves to ask about the economy? What sort of deep-seated assumptions, maybe even unnamed assumptions, lurk around how we think about the economic system? That will constrain what policies can be entertained, and that what policies can be entertained will either support or hinder incredible practices that we need to emerge at the practice level. And it's a really helpful, I think, mapping out of the different levels of where action needs to happen. And fortunately, there are people working at all those different levels and creating the interactions between those different levels. And I want to share a few of those examples. There are many, many more in the report, but these are just a couple of headline ones to whet your appetites. So really thinking about the economy. Of course, the Australian Treasury just a few years ago released the Measuring What Matters statement, saying that these are the various themes that we want to support in Australia. Now, Australia joins over 70% of OECD governments in having a multi-dimensional wellbeing statement or dashboard like this. It is the beginnings of starting to broaden out measures of success beyond just simply counting quarterly increases in GDP, as we saw yesterday. In South Australia, they have an economic statement, and it's a little bit fuzzy on this slide here, but those fuzzy words at the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, on the front page of South Australia's economic statement, they say the words, "We want an economy that is fit for the future and that improves the well-being of all South Australians." Now, why I share that with you is that I think those words and the words following it, where they say, "We'll know we've succeeded when our industries are sustainable and powered by renewable energy, when more South Australians are in meaningful work and paid fairly, when all South Australians feel the benefits of our economy, we'll know we've got it right." And they finish this particular section of the statement by saying, "We'll know we've got it right. We'll know we've succeeded when we care as much about the state our children and their children will inherit as about the headline statistics of today." Why I share this with you is I think it's a beautiful example of a government recognising the economy as being in service of those outcomes, social and society wellbeing outcomes, rather than the other way around. So those little words at on that very front page of saying we want an economy that's fit for the future and that serves the well-being of all South Australians, I think is about getting that mindset right of seeing the economy as helping take care of communities and the planet. Here in Victoria, the Shire of Mount Alexandria has its economic statement that is all about saying we want to build a well-being economy in the Shire. And then there, Matt Driscoll says, we want to build the idea of the wellbeing economy inspired by First Nations traditions and focus on things like quality of life, environmental sustainability, social justice, and really put flourishing of nature as the definition of the success and richness of our lives. All of those are different examples of starting to shift the ideas around how the economy operates, who it serves, and what it delivers. Governments then, when you come down to more the policy regime, they can do a lot to steer the good stuff and to stop the bad stuff. And here's one of my favourite examples of a government steering the good stuff. The European Union has asked all its member states to support in different ways the emergence of the circular economy, where we reuse resources, keep material resources in circulation much longer rather than just throwing them out and adding to a pile of pollution. And what Sweden did to encourage that is it reduced its VAT on repairing items from 25% down to 12.5%, so that people like us will see a financial incentive to repair our goods, our jeans, our toasters, rather than just throwing things away. In Italy, for decades, they have had a whole lot of policy instruments to support worker-owned cooperatives. The Macora laws here are just some of them, where they support workers buying the businesses and they invest in cooperative ecosystems. There's reduced taxes on cooperatives and all sorts of other mechanisms to encourage the emergence of these sorts of economic actors, worker-owned cooperatives in this case. But in terms of stopping the bad stuff happening, I love this example from France, where they have said, if you can get somewhere in less than 2.5 hours by train, you can't get a plane. We're going to just ban those problematic, polluting short-haul flights. And again, to come back to South Australia, a tiny example, not nearly enough, but it's a great example of a state just saying, we know those tiny little plastic soy sauce fishes that you get with your sushi are bad for the planet, so we're going to ban them. They're the sorts of different levers we need government to be turning their attention to much more proactively. And then when it comes to the practice level, there are so many examples of businesses and enterprises in Australia and around the world that show us that a different way of doing things is not just desirable, that it's eminently doable. And a couple that we talk through in the report, our friends at Earthworker Cooperative down in the Latrobe Valley, who own their business. So the mission of Earthworker is to serve the worker owners of that business. And that's the bottom left-hand corner there on your screen. And the other picture is our friends at Food Connect in Brisbane, Food Connect Shed, where it's all about reimagining how the food system operates. And they have a very different ownership and financing model where they don't have owners, but they have careholders, people who are investing in the mission of that entity. This is a restaurant that used to operate just south of the Sydney Central train station called and it's a beautiful looking restaurant. Every time I've tried to go there, it was booked out. So I haven't visited yet, and it's just moved premises. So I'm hoping to go and see its new site. But their mission is to make everything that you touch, smell, eat, and drink out of things that would have been thrown away. And so their beautiful cocktails, their food, would have gone to the skip or landfill by others in the food sector. And even their rather funky looking bars that you can see and their tables there are made by Tupperware that colleagues in the food sector, other actors in the food sector would have thrown away. has said, give that to us and we'll make the most of it and turn it into something beautiful. Internationally, this is Triodos Bank. It's a Dutch bank. It's a registered B Corp. And their mission is to direct financial credit flows into the sorts of businesses that are needed for a more sustainable, more humane economy. Things like renewable energy. They're huge backers of renewables across Europe, but they're also walking the talk in that this is a photo of their headquarters in the Netherlands, and it's completely able to be dismantled. And every single piece of glass or steel used again, and it's held together by screws. So it's deliberately designed for dismantle and reuse and recycling. Triodos is also really interesting because it's reimagining the role of banking and the finance sector in a post-growth economy, and it's really putting out some very, very interesting thinking about how can finance serve a post-growth economy. And here's one of my favourite examples because it's from Scotland, a place close to my heart. This is a really massive beauty products firm called Faith in Nature. They make loads of shampoo and conditioner and shower gel. What they have done is on their board, they have appointed someone whose job it is to represent the interests of nature. And so around the board table, when there's decisions being made about production and consumption and investment and who they employ and where they work, there is someone there whose job it is to stand up for the interests of nature. Beautiful innovation in board governance, but certainly not the only company that is taking these steps at the moment. So where are we at? I think a really positive reading is that Australia is not short of incredible ideas, evidence that we need to change, and the energy to build a wellbeing economy, to build an economy that serves people and planet and not the other way around. And yet that progress remains fragmented and vulnerable to pushback. And what we see is that upstream change at the level it's needed, really stopping damage happen rather than just being content to patch up downstream after damage has happened, is driven by crisis responses, by narrow mindsets, by vested interests who do very, very well out of the current system, and by just ways of working inside government that tend to reward the status quo. And so the positive reading of where we're up to is what I call Lego wins. So if any of you find this a familiar scene of maybe a child or a grandchild, you can imagine a child's room with bits of Lego all over the floor. We're a little bit like that in best case scenario, in that there is no shortage of good examples of practices, good examples of policies that are in place amongst governments here in Australia and across the world. There's no shortage of incredible enterprises like those that I've shown you and many more like them who show that it is possible to do things differently. But they're a little bit like Lego on this floor, scattered, disconnected, and therefore vulnerable to being trodden on and pushed back and kicked out. And that's because we haven't yet had enough of a conversation about reimagining the economy as serving us rather than the other way around. The dominant economic discourse in Australia is still tied up with outdated thinking, discredited assumptions, and shibboleths that lock us into the same old recipes rather than imagining a different, better, future fit economic future. And so, what it's going to take to get there, and we can explore this in the conversation, is no single organization, no single person, no single policy change will be enough. We need a mosaic of people and actors, a movement made up by incredible voices, incredible different people, all working at different places inside government, outside government, in boardrooms, in factories, in communities, in academia, in schools, and across, meetings around the country. We need all sorts of different people. And I find when I feel a little bit hopeless, I remind myself of this beautiful proverb from our Maori colleagues. And the translation is, if everyone plays their part, the job will be done. That is what we need now, is all hands on deck to build the sort of economic system that will take care of people and planet. Liz, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And we have 80 people with us today. And I just think if every one of us has conversations with 5 or 10 people about the opportunity for us to shift our economic systems, it will all help contribute towards that momentum that we need so much, and the concept of a mosaic movement. Thank you, Catherine, very, very much. I'd love to start by picking up on the concept of hope. I mean, you've just shared some incredible and diverse examples of communities and governments and businesses that are thinking differently about policy, the products and services they provide, and how they engage with the economy. And yet you have described that these wins are Lego wins, and that we remain incredibly sort of vulnerable and fragmented. In that context and the enormity of the work that we need to do, what gives you a sense of hope on a day-to-day basis?
Liz, it's a lovely question. And I think we all need hope because that's what keeps driving us and gives us a sense of taking that inspiration from those beautiful examples. And I think what gives me hope is behind every one of those Lego wins, there are amazing, passionate, cool people who are using their different spheres of influence to make change where they can. They might be people deep in heart of government, and we work with many of those people who are inside the corridors of power, making changes on the policy front, or really trying to convince colleagues that business as usual can't carry on. They're people inside big companies, small family-owned businesses, local community-owned businesses who are saying, yes, we need to be commercially viable, we need to be financially successful, but that's not the point. The point is to show how businesses can be part of building a better Australia. And of course, there are so many people in communities, in cities and in suburbs, regional, rural communities who are working together to take care of each other when there's crisis, and then also to imagine better. And I feel one of the most privileged aspects of this work is getting to meet just a handful of those people. There's so many more that we haven't yet met. And I think that is the source of hope, that despite the enormity of the challenge, people are out there in their different ways, probably not using the terminology of wellbeing economy or economic system change, but rolling up their sleeves in their different spheres of influence and making change happen and showing that it is possible and that actually there is no excuse for not changing. That's where I find hope. What about you, Liz? Because I know you spend a lot of time with those sorts of communities. What brings hope for you?
I do, and I think my response is actually quite similar, Catherine. It's the incredible people that we get to work with every day right around the country. And I'm just thinking back, just last week, my colleague Seda and I were down in Latrobe Valley in Morwell, supporting the Net Zero Economy Authority to run a series of big workshops with community and business leaders. We worked with close to 200 people over the course of 2 days, all bringing together their ideas and their insights to shape the future of Latrobe Valley and the broader Gippsland region. And many of those individuals and organisations have been engaged many times before about the energy transition and the future of the valley, and yet continue to show up with incredible commitment and energy and amazing ideas. And it all helps build this sense of what's possible. But also, I think it's really important to acknowledge the progress that's happening already. And I think it's, we're seeing that work happening at a community level. Part of the challenge or the opportunity for us now is to make that work visible at a national scale so that we can collectively see and feel that there are different kinds of values coming to the forefront, to shift the dominant rhetoric. So yeah, I think that gives me incredible hope. And I think there's a big difference too, and I know you and I talk about this all the time, Catherine, between sometimes the discourse in mainstream media and the reality of what's happening at a community scale.
Indeed. And if folks have a chance to read the report, we share little snippets and highlights of some of the conversations that the Next Economy is having with really diverse regional communities in Australia. And I think what readers we've kept their own words, but what I think readers will see is that there's incredible commonality at the heart of the priorities that people are identifying of what good development, what a healthy, good economic transition looks like. It's really incredible, and you've heard me say this phrase a lot before, but there's this beautiful phrase from Frances Moore Lappy, who's an American scholar, and she says, "Why are we collectively creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want?" And I think that often, comes back to how the economic system has been designed and delivered. And I think the task, and this is why economic change is so important, is to realign the economy with what people really want and need.
So that's probably a great segue, Catherine, for me to say, what do you think are the biggest barriers to being able to sort of shift the dominant narrative and paradigm that we see at that sort of macro level?
Yeah, we're up against a lot. I mean, there's the really obvious, really overt blockers of people who do pretty well out of the current system, whether that's a sense of status or wealth or power, and then they can use that wealth and power to influence politics. And there's been incredible work around Australia of analysts trying to document the extent of that. And I think if we take that really seriously, it's undermining Australia's democracy. So it's important to look at that. There's also a different form of blocking, and maybe blocking is not the right word, but recalcitrance maybe, that we see in just the deference, the unthinking deference to outdated thinking and discredited orthodoxy. And you have a lot of assumptions around the economy, often repeated as nauseam, as if they're fact. And we see that influence over the debate about economic change, and we see it influence economic policy making as well. I often also think, though, it's Liz, you are way too young to remember this, but in 1983, Ronald Reagan said, "There is no limits to economic growth because there's no limits to human imagination and ingenuity." And I think in a way now, it's limited imaginations that are locking us in as into conversations that all we can do is patch up the current state of play, that business as usual is all we've got. And at best, what we can do is fight for a better funded band-aid to patch up the damage. And I think that is a real block, isn't it? To this too. And I think that's where it comes back to our first point of discussion around these incredible examples are showing that it is possible. And if we could only take inspiration from those, groups like Earthworker and Food Connection that show it's possible and use that to expand our imaginations. Because if you think differently about something, that will change how you then can act about it. And we can have a completely different conversation. And to go back to that changing mindset, that will then enable different policies. So that's one of the challenges. On a more prosaic level, I mean, I think we need to be really honest, people like me who are impatient for change, just how hard changes in government are. There's just the dead hand of inertia and the received way of doing things and the bias towards the status quo. There's also the fact that the current challenges are very real, and so often governments rushing from crisis to crisis. We can cut them a bit of slack for that because those crises are really pressing. But I think the task is for governments to be able to, as my colleague Warwick, who I think is here, says, walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, respond to that immediate damage that's necessary, help people survive and cope with today and tomorrow. but also pay attention to raising our gaze to the roots of that damage and dare to imagine something different there. I think to build that, we need sort of the countervailing force to those vested interests that I talked about earlier, and that's by expanding the conversations around the possibility of economic change. But you have a different vantage point on some of those questions too through your work with regions and with enterprises. What would you add to that list of some of the roadblocks?
Oh, Catherine, there's so many parts of what you've just shared I'd like to respond to. I might just start by saying that our beautiful planet has limited resources, and I think we fundamentally need to shift how we think about our relationship with the environment and the impact of unlimited growth. It's just not possible to keep using resources. We need to be shifting a paradigm towards one that's very much living with our beautiful ecosystems and regenerating. And I think one of the things I find most perhaps inspiring about what you presented today is that every one of us can start talking about the economy and own our role in shaping the economy rather than perhaps leaving economic policy and practice to the realm of politicians and economists. And I think that whilst the language varies across regions, that's what we're seeing so many leaders and community members talking about what a strong future ready economy looks like, and within that, yes, there's economic diversification, but there's a focus on mitigation and adaptation to climate impacts, really building on circular economy principles, build, all the enabling infrastructure and services we need upstream for thriving communities, practices that can regenerate the environment. And if I just pick one example, we've done a lot of work up in Mount Isa over the last 18 months. They've already got some really innovative opportunities to put these kinds of values into practice. Just one of them being the potential repurposing of big mine shafts up there at the copper mine for gravitational energy storage systems, so that not only are they generating more renewable energy, but they're storing it in a very significant way and using that to support a diversification of industry. And one type of industry that they're really looking to build up is use of the new materials recovery facility to then support a whole range of enterprise around those product streams. So, we're seeing this happen on a daily basis. And I think elevating those stories and sharing them so that all of us around Australia can understand what's happening is just so important. Coming to your point about barriers, though, in regions, one of the critical issues is a lack of resourcing for coordinated, strategic and well-supported planning work and the activation of the future economies that regions are looking to build. Local government often play a critical role in that process and often have very, very small teams that are trying to manage that work. So that's an area that I think really needs a lot of attention, because there's a Herculean effort underway there across regions in that respect. And there needs to be, I think, and there is an emerging focus on the cumulative impacts of new development and really thinking carefully about what that means for communities, from really practical matters like how are new renewable energy systems going to impact on roads, through to housing, for example, and how does temporary worker housing construction, as perhaps new renewable energy come in, benefit the community long term and actually address social housing challenges and long-term community needs. So to your point there around imagination and creativity, I think we need so much more, and it is starting to happen, but we need to foster and invest in it as much as we can.
Absolutely. It's wonderful. And for colleagues who are on the call who may not be quite so familiar with the Next Economy's work, do you want to just say a few words about how our role in that economic change with regions like Mount Isa and Gladstone and Hay and Latrobe and many other places?
How does that work in practice?
Yeah, how we work with those communities.
We're invited in to support regions with planning processes as they think about navigating complex impacts on their economy and start wanting to proactively shape a different kind of future. We then co-design a very inclusive planning process, engaging broadly and deeply with very diverse organisations and individuals, from community members through to all levels of government, business and industry representatives, climate environment movement. And our role really is to create or hold a safe space for people to be able to share their ideas and to have enough time together to actually identify priorities, plan actions, and then to really resource those actions going forward. And then part of our role as well is to be able to connect regions with resources. That might be expertise, through our networks, or it might be access into the philanthropic sector and impact investment. All the while, we're working together with regions to share insights and lessons with all levels of government and industry in particular, and other regions, so that we can help improve practice and answer that question of what does good development look like together.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. So, Catherine, I'm tracking what's coming through by way of questions, and we've actually got some amazing resources and links that are being shared too.
One of the best things about these webinars, isn't it? People sharing with each other.
It really is. And I think there's a recurring question that I'd love to put to you now, and that's, at a really practical level, what suggestions do you have for individuals on today's call about the next steps that they can take?
And I love that question, because it shows people are up for being part of the positive change, but it's also actually a really hard question to answer, because the answer is really, it depends on where your energy is, where you're working, where you live. Everyone will have a different sphere of influence, different channels that they can, and sort of communities that they can activate and engage with. And I guess my advice would be, look around, see, maybe it's your workplace. Maybe you could even have a conversation about, could your workplace become, worker-owned business? If you're working in a community that you see a shared need, could you team up with other people and start addressing that? And there are people on this call who have examples of that. And we talk, for example, about some of the work that's being done in Castlemaine by our friends at Castlemaine Institute, to team up and as a community address some of the challenges in that area. But there'll be people here who work in local government, in state government, in federal government, and all of them will have different ways they can mobilize what they have to hand, whether that's maybe creating a discussion group with colleagues to bring in some of this thinking and challenge some of that, maybe I'd call it sort of 20th century thinking, but share literature. There's an ample literature of journal articles and books that are starting to really show the possibility of economic change. There's loads of evidence that it's possible, not just needed. So maybe share that around colleagues. Maybe it's people who have capacity to leverage procurement, for example, by local government, to bring to the fore worker-owned co-ops, or maybe more locally owned businesses, or decent jobs for maybe some groups who are further from the labour market. And across that, so there's all sorts of different things, and it depends really on where your energy is and where you feel your opportunity is. But across that, I think the one thing that people can do that I think is most important is just don't be content with business as usual, and to, as you've heard me say a lot, channel your inner 3-year-old and ask why. So I'm at the moment here in Melbourne with our colleagues at the Greater Melbourne Foundation. And when I walked this morning just a few blocks from the hotel I was staying in up to these offices in the Queen Vic markets, I must have passed at least a dozen people sleeping rough in doorways in one of the richest cities in the world. And it breaks my heart. And I could stop and buy a breakfast, or give $100 for someone so they can access a shelter. But I think also and that's important, and to do that is important. It's a compassionate, empathetic response. But we also need to ask, why are so many people sleeping rough in the richest city like such a rich city like Melbourne? And to do that to so many issues, whether it's rising levels of mental ill health amongst young people, or loneliness, or plastic pollution, and so many different issues, we need to channel our inner 3-year-old and ask why, and because that's when the economic system comes into view, and that's when then the question of imaginations. And so I guess my overriding message is to channel your inner 3-year-old. That's a practical thing people can do.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. And I'm just going to pull out a few more questions that are coming through
Great.
the chat now. I'm going to start with Peter M, who's asking a question actually that ties back to the concept of Lego wins. Peter shares that the beauty of Lego is that it's a universal toy, and so it's common around the world. So Peter's question is, what's the common unit that connects all economic activity globally?
Oh gosh, that's a beautiful question. Well, it depends how you're defining economic activity, Peter. I'd love to hear your answer to that question actually. But in the report at the beginning pages, we really share a lot of different perspectives on what the economy is. So often when you hear the word the economy, I mean, at least I do, I think of usually men in pinstripe suits shouting at screens. And of course, that's a very outdated image of the economy because you don't even have those sorts of stock markets anymore. But people tend to think it's, that's what the economy is about, the realm of profit and loss and gross domestic product. But the original meaning of the word economy was about household management. And I love that because if we expand our definition of the household and we're really fulsome with our definition of management, it basically means taking care of everyone on our precious home. And so there's all these sort of other schools of thought around how that can be done. But I think what connects them all is this idea of the economy being in service of social and environmental goals rather than the other way around. And we talk in the report about how, and this is sort of one of the, I guess, the connecting pieces of lots of other different schools of thought around economic change. And Peter, I often use the metaphor of the picnic blanket in that there are so many amazing schools of thought, whether that's donut economics or regenerative economics or solidarity economy or Bren Vivere or indigenous thinking or feminist economics and so on. And so on and so on and so on. At their core, they have this understanding that the economy is a subset of society and the two are the subset of nature. And to take that very seriously means asking very different questions of what sort of economy we have and who it's working for. And so I suspect I probably mangled Peter's original intention with his question, but I think at the core of a lot of those different beautiful, amazing schools of thought that will resonate in different areas and have their different resonance and different emphasis, this idea of really reimagining the economy as in service of us rather than the other way around is at the class. That's quite different to the dominant way of thinking about the economy. Which is so often connected by GDP growth and profit and loss and consumption without thinking what is it people and communities really need and what's in line with what our planet needs to survive.
Yeah. So, Catherine, I think there's a fabulous connection between your answer here for Peter and one that Andrew's posed about how do we create a space for a much bigger, broader public conversation about what we want the economy to look like. I'd love you to sort of share your thoughts on how we might do that.
Andrew, that is what keeps me awake at night, and what I hope in my small little way, and with my incredible colleagues at the Next Economy and colleagues across the emerging and diverse and beautifully pluralistic economic change movement to contribute to is sort of opening up the conversation around the possibility of an economy that much better serves people and planet than the one we've got, which, if we're really honest, is very extractive and serves very well the very few. Opening up that space, I think, is really, even daring to give ourselves permission to imagine something better. Having the courage, and I find this hard, to challenge conventional wisdom and economic orthodoxy where it's peddled as ad nauseum. And I think you see that quite a bit in recent months with discussion around the productivity agenda. I think we need to be really careful around how that is framed. What is the purpose? And I see my colleague Warwick's here from the Centre for Policy Development. They've been doing a lot of great work on productivity with purpose. What is the purpose of this? Who is it for? What is it we actually want more of, rather than just getting tied up in something I said at the very beginning of my slide deck, the tyranny of averages, where we just look at headline figures measured per capita and think things are great when so many people in Australia know that they're not.
Very true. And Catherine, I can't help but think, but one of the pathways that we have to support that much broader public conversation is actually through the arts. And Simone's asked about the role that the arts can play in supporting the communication of different kinds of narratives.
Simone, great question.
I know you've seen some fabulous examples of that around the world.
Oh yeah. I mean, artists are so good at not just shining a mirror on what's wrong, I mean, Banksy being one really obvious example, but cartoonists, and look at how we've utilized Jess Harwood's work in this report just so crisply with one image, to encapsulate so many of the big trends and patterns. So shining a mirror is part of it. Then helping describe the beautiful different. Artists are incredible at I think depicting in different ways what could be better, helping open up our imaginations. But there's also something about the different way that artists, and there's exceptions to this, of course, but artists often, living through their art rather than by, seeing money as the only currency. And artists are often really good at sharing resources, taking care of each other. And so not having money the key determinant of whether they thrive. And yet in so many contexts in Australia, because of the way things are set up, if you don't have enough money, you're in a real pickle. So I think there's inspiration on many fronts from artists. And as someone who is constantly using cartoons in my
Hey, yes,
talks.
Chris Harwood's work.
Yeah, I mean it's just art has such an important and I'm so grateful to those cartoonists and those artists, documentary makers, really important as well, and filmmakers and painters and sculptors. I mean, there's a beautiful sculpture, I think it's in Berlin, and it's got all these little sculptural heads, but underwater up to about there. And I think the title, and forgive me for getting this wrong, but the title is something like "Leaders Discussing Global Warming." I mean, that's a beautiful sculpture that will probably reach more people than any missive from the climate COP negotiations will reach. Just people walking past, catching a glimpse of that will plant a seed to think differently. Yeah, it's a beautiful question, Simone. And if you're an artist, please maybe put your website or where we can see your art, Simone, or any art that inspires you, put that in the chat so we can follow it up.
Catherine, I just thought that was such a great question because art is so influential in our culture and our experience of culture. And ultimately, I think that's what we're talking about really is the mindsets and how we enact those through all parts of our lives. So thank you, Simone, for that question. We've had dozens of questions here, Catherine, and unfortunately, we're pretty much coming up to the 60-minute mark. So I think perhaps we'll take those questions away and see what we can come back to folks with. Just before we wrap up, I'm wondering, Catherine, if there were any sort of key messages you'd love to share with everybody, just sort of in closing.
Well, one, thanks for coming along, because the conversations will only be shifted by people learning from each other. I hope the report is useful to folks. It's free on our website. Please take it, download it, share it, talk about it. But also thanks for everyone who's here for the work you respectively do. You might be in government, you might be academics, you might be someone who's just curious, you might be someone who runs a book club, you might just talk to your neighbour, to your hairdresser, to your friends across the street. All of that matters. So I'm just grateful for people paying attention to this conversation. And Liz and colleagues, thanks for making it happen.
Thank you, Catherine, for all of your work, bringing conversations about economic systems change to the fore, for your presentation and today's discussion as well. And I know you've got a busy program coming up of more events and presentations and conversations, and we very much hope that everybody on today's call can be a part of that journey with us. I'd love to reiterate Catherine's appreciation for your giving up the time today to join us. We're going to follow up with the recording of today's webinar. We're also going to circulate some resources, and we'd love you to stay in contact with us if you're interested in following our journey or being a part of our work. We are very much on a learning journey, I think it would be fair to say, Catherine, but we're going to be far more effective when we all do that together. So thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, everybody, very much for your time today. We'll be in contact again soon. Bye-bye.